Hey everybody, it's Chris Gonman, author of the Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Game. I have been promising for some time to do a video about NPCs, advice on using them, deploying them, and so forth. And I decided it was time to finally do it. Now, I'll let you know I've tried to record this video several times. I have failed every time to complete it. I keep wandering off, digressing, and so forth, so I'm going to try to keep this real short. One of the things that I run into a lot, I've run into in the past, when running games based on somebody else's material, somebody else's world or adventure or whatever, is player characters recognizing or failing to recognize NPCs. They just don't become distinctive. Especially when you're using someone else's work, it's difficult to make NPCs interesting. Now, if your characters in your game are typical murder hobos and they're wandering from town to town, committing violence and so forth, then they're not going to be meeting the same NPCs most of the time that often, although I got some ideas on that. Hopefully the digression won't wander off too long when I go off in that direction. But if your player characters are in a village or city, either where they're actually having their adventures or which is their home base between adventures, then you're going to have repeat NPCs. You're going to have NPCs that they see on a regular basis. This is not a bad situation. This is almost an ideal situation when they're seeing the NPCs on a regular basis. But you still want to make them distinct. The secret, in my mind, to making NPCs interesting and allowing for your players to remember them is not to introduce too many of them at a time. I call this the Harry Potter method. There are a crap ton of characters in Harry Potter, but if you go back and pay attention as you're reading the books, you only see a few of them at a time in the beginning. Just a few people. The major characters are introduced in the first book, meaning the kids themselves, the teachers, Dumbledore, and so forth. You meet them initially. The greater world is largely ignored. And this is fine. As the books progress and the kids grow up, you are introduced to more and more characters until you have this whole world of distinct weird characters in your head. Initially, we meet Ron Weasley and his mother, and we see the rest of the family, but we don't really meet them. By the end of the book, but the end of the series, we know the Weasleys pretty well, the whole darn family of them. And it's the same thing applies to a lot of characters in the books. Doing this in a game is not all that complicated. I have a game I'm working on right now, actually, that takes place in a town. The characters will be around this town for an extended period while they go through a series of adventures that are based nearby. And I have just described and prescribed in the introductory materials that the game master should introduce the characters a few at a time. Little set piece scenes in the tavern in the morning before, or in the inn, wherever they're eating breakfast, in the morning before they go out to do whatever their adventure is. A little scene involving 2 or 3 of the NPCs interacting with each other and the player characters. Later on, at the beginning or the end of the next session, another little set scene involving other characters, maybe repeating 1 or 2 characters from the first scene, but with other characters, so we can introduce them 1 or 2 at a time and allow the player characters to get to know them. Now, I'm a proponent of sandboxes, and hopefully this is not going to become a long digression, but I'm a fan of sandboxes. I'm a believer in sandboxes. I'm going to talk about that in a future video. If you're doing this, you should be rolling reaction rolls. Unless the reactions of the NPCs to your player characters are extremely obvious. In other words, it says in the module, he hates dwarves. Well, a dwarf player character is probably not going to be someone that this NPC is going to like. But unless they're given, you should be using reaction rolls and applying charisma bonuses or penalties to figure out if these NPCs like or dislike your player characters and go forward from there. Your player characters will most likely develop friendships with some of these NPCs. You use this. Once they have friends, their friends can ask them for help. Oldest storytelling technique ever, I think. So this is an important thing you want to cultivate. I said I was going to talk about the murder hobos. So your characters are traveling from dungeon to dungeon. They barely light in town at all. They come into a town, they buy some gear, they get out of town, the people in the town breathe a sigh of relief, wipe the sweat from their brows, and go back to work. Happy that their town hasn't been burned to the ground or they haven't been massacred, because this is a bunch of crazy murder hobos. But some of your, if you're using random encounters for your characters, or even if you're using set encounters for your characters as they're traveling from town to town, as they're traveling on the road, some of the encounters can be repeats. You can have them encounter the same merchant caravan. Say they're going to a town on the borderlands, and they meet this merchant leaving, and he can tell them how terrible things are there and so forth. And then they might run into him again after they've returned from the borderlands back to civilization. They might bump into him in a tavern somewhere, and he might say, "Well, how did you find it?" or whatever. What was it like when you were in that keep out there in the middle of nowhere? Did you see any orcs? Whatever. And you can have interactions like that. Even if they're not friends with these NPCs, the fact that they know each other, well, number one, it immerses your players in your world more. They feel more connected to your world if they know people there, if they're familiar with these fictional people you've created, if they feel like their characters belong to something. This is always tricky because player characters seem to always have no siblings. Their parents are dead, no connection almost to anything, which does kind of explain why they're murder hobos, but it does make them rather disconnected. Connecting them through NPCs that they befriend or that they make enemies of does help immerse them in the world. If you're an Indiana Jones fan, you'll know that his various rivals and enemies that he encounters in the movies, those are just as interesting in encounters. It's much more interesting to encounter the Nazi you've encountered before, who still has a grudge against you, than it is to encounter a brand new, fresh Nazi who doesn't know you. And you can substitute orc or giant or stormtrooper or whatever for Nazi, whatever type of game you're running. And I guess that's it. That's my advice. Introduce your characters a few at a time. Let your players get a chance to get to know them. If your characters are wandering, remember that other characters wander, and that they can, in fact, meet the same merchant or the same noble or whatever again someplace else that they've met in a previous encounter. Keep those characters around. Use them. This is one of the easiest ways to achieve a sensation of immersion among your players. So that's it for today. Hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about sandboxes sometime soon. Talk to you later.